A black man is not allowed on a yacht, but the security guard has no idea who he's up against. Find out how this incident changed everything. Subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the harbor, its rays bouncing off the sleek, polished hulls of docked yachts. The marina in the Hamptons was a place of quiet luxury, where the scent of salt water mixed with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting from a nearby cafe. The rhythmic creak of wooden docks underfoot and the gentle clinking of rigging against masts provided a symphony of subtle sounds that perfectly complemented the scene. Jerome Blake pulled his black Tesla smoothly into a reserved parking space marked Owners Only. The car, freshly washed, gleamed in the sunlight. Stepping out, he adjusted his linen shirt and ran a hand over the polished surface of his car as he opened the trunk to retrieve a leather travel bag. Today wasn't just any day. It marked his first full weekend with his new yacht, the Freedom, a long-awaited symbol of his achievements. Jerome paused for a moment to take in the view. The water stretched out endlessly, its surface sparkling like a field of diamonds under the sun. Around him, owners and guests milled about, many dressed in breezy summer attire, their laughter mingling with the distant hum of boats pulling in and out of the harbor. It felt surreal to be here, standing among the elite, the very people he once only read about in glossy magazines. But Jerome wasn't the type to dwell on the past. Not anymore. He was here because he'd earned his place, though he couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort as he noticed a few glances lingering on him longer than usual. The stares weren't overtly hostile, but they carried the unmistakable weight of curiosity tinged with skepticism. Shaking it off, he grabbed his bag and started toward the dock. As he walked, memories surfaced unbidden, tugging at the edges of his thoughts. Growing up in the south side of Chicago, Jerome had never imagined that one day he would stride confidently into a marina like this one. His childhood was marked by struggle. His parents worked tirelessly, often taking on multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. Summers weren't spent by the water, but on the sweltering streets of his neighborhood, where opportunities seemed as scarce as shade. Jerome's determination to escape that cycle of struggle began early. He devoured books, studied relentlessly, and chased every opportunity, no matter how daunting. College had been a turning point, though not without its challenges. He had been one of the few black students in his program and often found himself the subject of dismissive assumptions. But Jerome wasn't easily deterred. Through persistence, he had turned a small tech startup idea into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. The Freedom was his victory lap, a testament to years of sacrifice and unrelenting effort. The docks beneath Jerome's feet creaked softly as he approached the mooring where Freedom was birthed. But just as he was about to step onto the dock leading to his yacht, a figure materialized in his path. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a Navy security uniform that seemed a size too snug. His face was lined with the weathering of years spent under the sun, and his gray-blue eyes carried a scrutinizing intensity. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, his tone neutral but firm. "Can I help you?" Jerome stopped, the unexpected interruption catching him off guard. "I'm just heading to my yacht," he replied, keeping his voice calm and polite. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "This is a private marina. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Jerome frowned inwardly but maintained his composure. "Yes, I'm sure. I'm the owner of the Freedom, docked right over there," he said, gesturing toward his yacht, its name proudly emblazoned on the side. The man, whose name tag read Rick Holloway, didn't move. Instead, he crossed his arms, his stance turning subtly more confrontational. "Do you have any proof of ownership?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Jerome felt a flicker of irritation but suppressed it. He reached into his bag and retrieved the necessary documents, handing them to Rick without a word. Rick took the papers and began scanning them, though his deliberate slowness made it clear he was less interested in verifying the information and more interested in asserting his authority. As Rick inspected the documents, Jerome couldn't help but notice the contrast between his treatment and that of other marina visitors. Just moments ago, a white couple had walked past Rick without so much as a glance in their direction. They had been laughing, their hands full of shopping bags, but Rick hadn't stopped them. The double standard was glaring. Jerome's mind raced as he stood there, his confidence giving way to a simmering frustration. He had experienced this before, being made to feel out of place in spaces he had every right to occupy. It was a subtle, insidious kind of prejudice, the kind that left you questioning whether you were imagining it, even as it eroded your dignity piece by piece. After what felt like an eternity, Rick handed the documents back. "Everything seems to be in order," he said, his tone grudging. "Thank you," Jerome replied evenly, though his patience was wearing thin. Rick stepped aside, and Jerome continued toward his yacht. As he walked, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the interaction. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it stung nonetheless. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Rick watching him, his gaze sharp and assessing. When Jerome finally stepped aboard the Freedom, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The yacht was immaculate, its sleek design a perfect blend of luxury and functionality. Inside, the interior was a haven of comfort, with plush seating, modern appliances, and expansive windows that offered stunning views of the harbor. It was everything Jerome had dreamed of and more. He set his bag down and took a deep breath, letting the tranquility of the space calm his nerves. But as he sat down and gazed out at the water, he couldn't shake the lingering unease. The marina was supposed to be a place of relaxation, a reward for his hard work, but it was clear that not everyone saw him as belonging here. For now, Jerome decided to focus on the positive. Tomorrow, his friends would join him, and they would set sail for a weekend of sun and open water. He wasn't about to let one unpleasant interaction ruin the experience. But deep down, he knew the events of the day were far from over. The next morning, Jerome Blake woke early, the soft rays of sunlight streaming through the blinds of his rented villa in the Hamptons. He stretched, shaking off the remnants of sleep, and checked his phone for messages. His friends had confirmed their arrival times, eager to join him on Freedom for a weekend of sailing and relaxation. It was a long overdue escape from their hectic lives, a moment to celebrate their collective successes. After a quick breakfast of coffee and toast, Jerome dressed casually in a light blue linen shirt, khaki shorts, and boat shoes. He grabbed a bottle of aged wine from the kitchen counter, a gift for his guests, and his leather travel bag containing essentials for the day. The excitement of sharing the Freedom with his friends buoyed his mood as he drove back to the marina. The air was crisp and fresh, the harbor alive with activity as yachts prepared to set sail. Jerome parked in his designated spot and made his way toward the dock where Freedom awaited. His steps were confident, but as he approached the familiar figure of Rick Holloway, the marina security guard, standing near the entrance to the docks, his mood faltered slightly. Rick's posture was rigid, his eyes narrowing as soon as he spotted Jerome. It was clear the guard remembered him, and not in a good way. Jerome took a steadying breath, telling himself to stay calm and professional. This was just another minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of things, he thought. "Morning," Jerome greeted with a polite nod, intending to walk past. Rick stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Hold on there, buddy. Where do you think you're going?" Jerome frowned but kept his tone even. "I'm going to my yacht. I've got guests arriving shortly." Rick crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "Your yacht, huh? Which one is it?" "The Freedom," Jerome replied, his patience already beginning to thin. "We went through this yesterday, remember? I showed you my documents." Rick's face hardened. "I'm going to need to see them again." A mix of frustration and disbelief surged within Jerome. "Are you serious? I already proved my ownership yesterday." Rick shrugged, his stance unyielding. "Just following protocol, you understand." Jerome clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his composure. He set his bag down and retrieved the documents, holding them out for Rick to inspect. But instead of taking them, Rick crossed his arms again, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Tell you what," Rick said, his tone laced with condescension. "Why don't you wait here while I call this in? Gotta make sure everything checks out." A small crowd had begun to gather nearby, marina staff, yacht owners, and passers-by curious about the interaction. Jerome noticed the sideways glances, the whispered comments. His frustration deepened as he realized how easily Rick was turning an ordinary moment into a spectacle. "I don't see anyone else being stopped," Jerome said, his voice calm but firm. "Are you checking every yacht owner's documents this morning, or is it just me?" Rick's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of anger. "Watch your tone," he snapped. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job." Jerome stared at Rick, his pulse quickening. The guard's defensiveness spoke volumes, but Jerome knew escalating the situation wouldn't help. He took a deep breath, pulling out his phone and unlocking it. "If you won't take my documents," Jerome said, "I'll record this and document everything myself. Let's make sure this is as transparent as possible." The sight of the phone visibly rattled Rick. His face reddened, and he took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You think filming me is going to scare me? Go ahead. I've got nothing to hide." Jerome began recording, his voice steady as he narrated the events. "This is Jerome Blake at the marina in the Hamptons. For the second day in a row, the security guard has refused to acknowledge my ownership of the Freedom, despite having all necessary documentation." The tension thickened as more people gathered to watch. Some had phones out, recording their own footage. Others exchanged concerned glances, murmuring quietly among themselves. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted, cutting through the tension. An older man in a crisp white polo shirt stepped forward. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his posture exuded quiet authority. "Is there a problem here?" Rick hesitated, clearly unsettled by the man's presence. "Just doing my job, Mr. Porter. This gentleman claims he owns one of the yachts, but I'm verifying his documents." Mr. Porter's eyes flicked to Jerome, then back to Rick. "That's Jerome Blake. I know who he is. He's the CEO of a tech company I follow closely. He's been featured in Forbes and Bloomberg. If he says he owns a yacht here, I'm inclined to believe him." Rick faltered, his confidence visibly shaken. "I was just being thorough," he muttered, stepping back. Mr. Porter turned to Jerome, offering an apologetic smile. "Mr. Blake, I'm sorry for this inconvenience. Please, go ahead." Jerome nodded his thanks, but the damage had been done. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder as he stepped past Rick, who now stood awkwardly to the side. As Jerome approached the Freedom, he noticed a few supportive smiles from other bystanders, but also a few lingering stares of suspicion. He boarded his yacht, setting his bag down with a sigh of relief. The interaction had left a bitter taste, a stark reminder that his success didn't shield him from prejudice. As he prepared the yacht for his guests, Jerome's mind raced with thoughts about what had just happened. He had done everything right, followed the rules, provided proof, but it still wasn't enough for some people. Looking out over the marina, Jerome resolved to stay calm and focused. Today was supposed to be a celebration, and he wouldn't let anyone take that away from him. Still, a part of him knew this was far from over. Jerome Blake stood on the deck of his yacht, Freedom, taking a few steadying breaths, trying to shake off the frustration from his confrontation with Rick. The incident had left him feeling disrespected and drained, a weight hanging heavy on his shoulders. But as he looked around at the luxurious interior of his yacht, the beauty of the marina, and the shimmering water, he reminded himself of the significance of this moment. He was finally in the position he had worked his entire life to achieve. He couldn't let anyone diminish that, not even a prejudiced security guard. Just as Jerome was trying to gather his thoughts, he heard voices approaching. He turned to see his friends arriving, several of his closest college buddies, including Marcus and Natalie, both of whom had been there from the beginning, when they were all just students with big dreams. Behind them were a few more friends, some from the tech world, some from his old neighborhood. "Jerome," Marcus called out, waving enthusiastically, "look at this beauty. Man, you really made it." Jerome smiled as he stepped down to greet them. "Hey guys, glad you made it. Welcome to the Freedom." They exchanged hugs, and Jerome's mood began to lift. The warmth of his friend's presence helped ease the tension that had been building since the morning. "Wow, this is stunning," Natalie said, looking around the yacht with wide eyes. "You've really outdone yourself." "Thanks," Jerome replied. "I've been waiting for this for a long time. Come on, let me give you all the grand tour." As Jerome showed his friends around, he felt a renewed sense of pride. The Freedom was a testament to everything he'd worked for, a symbol of overcoming adversity, achieving success against the odds. They walked through the cabins, admired the sleek design, and eventually made their way up to the deck, where Jerome uncorked the bottle of aged wine he had brought along. "To friendship, to success, and to living life on our own terms," Jerome said, raising his glass. His friends cheered, their glasses clinking together in a toast that echoed across the water. But the peace didn't last long. Out of the corner of his eye, Jerome noticed a pair of police officers approaching the dock, followed closely by Rick, who wore a triumphant expression. The sight of the guard, along with the officers, instantly shattered the festive atmosphere. Jerome's smile faded, and he set his glass down on the table. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, noticing Jerome's sudden change in demeanor. Jerome nodded towards the dock, where the officers were now standing, clearly looking for someone. "It looks like our friend from earlier has decided to escalate things." Natalie frowned. "You're kidding me. What does he want now?" The officers stepped onto the dock, and Rick gestured toward Jerome. "There he is," Rick said loudly. "That's the man I was telling you about." Jerome took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He walked to the edge of the yacht and called out, "Officers, is there a problem here?" One of the officers, a tall man with a serious expression, approached. "Sir, we've received a report from the marina security that there's been some trouble regarding ownership of this yacht. We need to verify your identity and documentation." Jerome nodded. He knew it was important not to show any sign of defiance or frustration. "Of course, I have all my documents right here." He walked over to his bag and retrieved the folder with his ownership papers, then handed them to the officer. The officer took the documents and began examining them. Jerome's friends watched from the deck, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. "This is unbelievable," Marcus muttered. "Why are they harassing you like this?" "Because they can," Natalie replied, her voice tinged with bitterness. "They see a black man on a yacht and immediately think he doesn't belong." The officer took his time, carefully inspecting every page. Rick stood by with a smug look on his face, clearly expecting that his version of events would be validated. The second officer, a younger woman, stood by silently, her gaze flicking between Rick and Jerome. After what felt like an eternity, the tall officer handed the documents back to Jerome. His expression had softened slightly, though it remained impassive. "Everything seems to be in order, Mr. Blake. We apologize for the inconvenience." Jerome took the documents, his jaw tight. "Thank you, officer," he said, keeping his tone as even as possible. Rick, however, wasn't done. He stepped forward, his voice rising. "I'm telling you, there's something off here. I've worked at this marina for years. I know who belongs and who doesn't." The second officer spoke for the first time, her voice firm. "Mr. Holloway, we've reviewed the documents and they're valid. There's no reason to continue this." Rick opened his mouth as if to argue, but the officer shot him a sharp look and he fell silent, his face flushing with anger. Jerome couldn't help but feel a small sense of vindication as he watched Rick's confidence crumble, but the moment was bittersweet. The fact that it had escalated this far in the first place left a bitter taste. As the officers turned to leave, the younger one gave Jerome a brief nod, her expression apologetic. Jerome nodded back, grateful for the small gesture. Rick, meanwhile, stood frozen for a moment before he finally turned and stalked away, his shoulders hunched in frustration. Jerome returned to his friends, who were now gathered around the table, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. He set the documents back in his bag and took a deep breath. "Sorry about that, everyone," he said, trying to force a smile. "I guess some people just can't handle the idea of change." Marcus shook his head, his eyes still on the departing officers. "That was messed up, man. You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Jerome said, his voice quieter now, "but it's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last." Natalie placed a comforting hand on his arm. "It shouldn't be like this. You belong here as much as anyone else." Jerome smiled at her, appreciating the support. "Thanks, Nat. I just wish we could have one day without all this." The mood had shifted, and Jerome could feel the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. But he refused to let it ruin their day. He looked around at his friends, the people who had stood by him through thick and thin, and he knew he couldn't let them see him defeated. "All right," Jerome said, clapping his hands together. "Enough of that. We're here to have a good time, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Let's get this yacht out on the water." His friends cheered, their voices filled with determination to make the most of the day. Jerome moved to the helm, starting the yacht's engines and preparing to leave the dock. As they began to pull away, he caught one last glimpse of Rick, standing on the shore, his face twisted in frustration. Jerome turned his attention back to the open water, feeling the wind begin to catch in the sails, the yacht gliding smoothly out into the bay. The marina receded behind them, and with it, the tension of the last hour began to fade. Jerome focused on the horizon, the endless expanse of blue that stretched out before them, and let himself feel the freedom he had fought so hard to earn. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the deck. Laughter slowly returned, and the tension melted away as they sailed farther from the shore. Jerome could feel the weight of what had happened, but he also felt something else, a sense of resolve. This was not just about him. It was about challenging the very systems that allowed people like Rick to act with impunity, about standing his ground not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. As the yacht cut through the water, Jerome looked at his friends and knew that today was a step toward something bigger. He couldn't change the world in one day, but he could start by refusing to back down, by insisting on his right to occupy the spaces he had earned. The day stretched on, and the laughter of his friends filled the air as they sailed. They anchored near a small cove, diving into the cool water, the waves washing away the remnants of the morning's ordeal. Jerome watched them, a smile finally finding its way back to his face. He was here, in this moment, with the people he cared about, and he would not let anyone take that from him. Back on shore, the story of what had happened was beginning to spread. Videos recorded by onlookers were being shared online, sparking conversations about prejudice and discrimination in the most unexpected places. Jerome didn't know it yet, but the events of the day were about to have far-reaching consequences, ones that would ripple far beyond the quiet marina in the Hamptons. That night, back in the villa he rented in the Hamptons, Jerome Blake sat on the terrace looking out at the darkened ocean. The rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore had always been calming, but tonight the tranquility felt hollow. The day, which had started with so much promise, had ended with a bitter reminder of the challenges he continued to face, even now, after everything he had accomplished. His phone buzzed on the table next to him, drawing his attention away from the waves. He reached for it, expecting a message from one of his friends. Instead, the screen lit up with dozens of notifications, texts, missed calls, and alerts from social media. Confused, Jerome unlocked his phone and began scrolling through the messages. The first message he opened was from Marcus. "Jerome, you won't believe it. You're trending. The video of that guard is everywhere. People are pissed." Jerome frowned, his heartbeat quickening. He switched over to his social media apps and was immediately met with a flood of message, reposts, and comments. There it was. The video that Marcus had recorded earlier, showing Rick stopping Jerome at the marina, the confrontation with the police, and the eventual apology from the officers. The video had gone viral. The caption read, "Black CEO harassed at marina for owning his own yacht." Below, thousands of comments were pouring in, some expressing outrage, others sharing similar stories of discrimination, and, of course, the inevitable trolls dismissing the incident or defending the actions of the guard. Jerome leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He hadn't expected this. He had recorded the confrontation for his own protection, as a way to document what had happened in case it escalated further. He hadn't intended for it to become a public spectacle, but now the story was out there, and there was no turning back. He scrolled through the comments, feeling a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a deep sense of exhaustion. This was the reality for so many people like him. It didn't matter how much success he achieved, how much he had worked to get to where he was. There were always people who would see only the color of his skin and decide that he didn't belong. As Jerome continued scrolling, he noticed that several major news outlets had picked up the story. Local news channels, national networks, even international outlets were reporting on the incident. The headlines varied in their tone, But the core message was the same. A black man, a successful entrepreneur, had been subjected to discrimination simply for being in a place where others thought he shouldn't be. Jerome felt a pang of unease as he read the headlines. He hadn't asked for this kind of attention. He was a private person by nature, preferring to focus on his work and the people he cared about. But now his name, his face, his story were being shared around the world. And with that attention came pressure. Pressure to respond, to speak out, to become a symbol for something larger than himself. He sighed, setting his phone down and closing his eyes for a moment. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't ignore this, couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. People were watching now, and they were looking to him for a response. Jerome opened his eyes and picked up his phone again. He opened his messaging app and typed a quick message to his assistant, asking her to draft a statement. He wanted to make sure that whatever he said was clear, measured, and impactful. He didn't want to lash out in anger. He wanted to use this moment to highlight the problem, to bring attention to the larger issues of systemic bias and prejudice that so many people faced. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed again. It was a call from his sister, Maya. Jerome answered, and her voice came through, full of concern. "Hey, Jerome, are you okay? I just saw the video. It's all over the place." "I'm fine, Maya," Jerome said, though his voice was tired. "I didn't expect any of this. It's been a lot." "I know," Maya said. "I just want you to know that I'm proud of you. You handled it with so much grace. You always do." Jerome smiled, though the weight of the day still lingered. "Thanks, Maya. I appreciate that. I'm just trying to figure out what to do next." "You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with," Maya said gently. "But if you want to speak out, if you want to make something good come out of this, I know you'll do it in the right way." Jerome nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Yeah, I think I have to. It's not just about me anymore." They talked for a while longer, Maya's voice a comforting reminder that he wasn't alone in this. By the time they hung up, Jerome felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just doing this for himself, he was doing it for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. For everyone who had been judged unfairly based on nothing more than the color of their skin. The next morning, Jerome woke up early. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft pink glow over the ocean. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, scrolling through his phone. His assistant had sent over a draft of the statement, and Jerome read through it carefully. He made a few edits, adding in his own voice, making sure that every word felt right. When he was satisfied, he posted it on his social media accounts. "Yesterday, I experienced something that unfortunately is all too common for people like me. Despite having worked hard to achieve my success, despite following all the rules, I was stopped and questioned simply because someone didn't believe I could belong in the space I was in. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that continues to see people of color as out of place in spaces of privilege. I hope that by sharing my story, we can bring attention to the biases that still exist and work toward creating a world where everyone is truly equal, no matter where they come from or what they look like." Within minutes, the post began to gain traction. Likes, comments, and shares poured in, and Jerome's phone buzzed constantly with notifications. He knew he had struck a chord, that his story was resonating with people. He also knew that this was only the beginning. As the day went on, Jerome received calls from various news outlets, all wanting interviews. His assistant helped him sift through the requests, and Jerome decided to accept a few. carefully selecting the platforms that he felt would help amplify his message in a meaningful way. Later that afternoon, Jerome sat in his living room, his laptop open in front of him for a video interview with a well-known morning show. The interviewer, a woman with a kind smile, greeted him warmly. "Jerome, thank you so much for joining us today. I know this has been a challenging time for you, but I want to say that your response has been incredibly powerful. Can you tell us a little bit about what was going through your mind during that incident?" Jerome nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Honestly, I was just trying to stay calm. I knew I'd done nothing wrong, but it's hard when you're put in a position like that, when someone looks at you and decides without knowing anything about you that you don't belong. I've faced situations like this before, but it doesn't get easier. I just kept thinking that I needed to handle it with dignity, because I knew people were watching." The interviewer nodded, her eyes sympathetic. "It's clear that this experience resonated with a lot of people. Your video has sparked a national conversation about bias and discrimination. What do you hope will come out of this?" "I hope that people will start to recognize the ways in which bias can show up in everyday situations," Jerome said. "It's not always overt. It can be subtle, but it's just as damaging. I want people to think about how they view others, about the assumptions they make. And I want to see real change, better training for people in positions of authority, more accountability, and a commitment to treating everyone with the respect they deserve." The interview continued, and Jerome spoke with honesty and passion. By the time it ended, he felt a sense of relief. He had said what he needed to say, and now it was up to others to listen, to take action. Over the next few days, the story continued to gain momentum. Civil rights organizations reached out to Jerome, offering their support. Other individuals, Black professionals, entrepreneurs, and ordinary citizens began sharing their own stories of discrimination, using the hashtag #StandWithJerome. It became a movement, a collective voice demanding change. Meanwhile, the marina and the yacht club found themselves under intense scrutiny. The video had exposed not only Rick's behavior, but also the broader culture that allowed such actions to go unchecked. The yacht club issued a formal apology to Jerome, promising to review their policies and implement new anti-discrimination training for their staff. Rick Holloway, the security guard, was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. As more details emerged, it became clear that Jerome's encounter was not an isolated incident. Several other people of color came forward, sharing similar experiences they had had at the marina. The pressure mounted, and eventually, Rick was terminated from his position. But for Jerome, this wasn't about getting one man fired. It was about something bigger, changing the narrative, changing the system. And as he watched the conversations unfold, as he read the stories that others were sharing, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something meaningful. One evening, a week after the incident, Jerome sat on the deck of the Freedom, watching the sun set over the horizon. The water was calm, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. He had been through a whirlwind of emotions in the past few days: anger, frustration, exhaustion. But now, sitting here, he felt a sense of peace. This was his space. He had earned it, and no one could take that away from him. Jerome picked up his phone, snapping a picture of the sunset and posting it with a simple caption: "Freedom means more than just a yacht. It means the right to be, to exist without question. Thank you all for standing with me. Let's keep pushing for a world where everyone belongs." And as the comments and likes began to pour in, Jerome knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for equality was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next, ready to stand his ground, to use his voice, and to demand the respect that he and so many others deserved. Jerome Blake sat in his home office, the midday sun filtering through the blinds, casting gentle stripes of light across his desk. It had been a week since the video from the marina had gone viral, and the fallout was still unfolding. His statement had resonated with thousands, and he had been swept into a movement larger than he ever anticipated. The days had been filled with interviews, messages of support, and meetings with civil rights groups. It felt overwhelming, but also purposeful. He felt as though he was riding the wave of change rather than merely observing it. Jerome's phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Marcus. "You still down for the event this weekend?" Jerome smiled. The event? What had started as a vague idea had turned into a concrete plan in the past few days, a way to take the momentum of the viral incident and transform it into something tangible, something positive. Marcus, Natalie, and a few other friends had jumped at the idea. They were going to host an event at the marina, bringing together people from all backgrounds to talk about equality and representation, to create a space that was inclusive rather than exclusive. Jerome typed out a quick reply. "Absolutely. I think this could really make a difference." The marina had agreed to allow them to use the space after Jerome's lawyers, along with mounting public pressure, had reached out. The Yacht Club, under scrutiny and eager to restore their public image, had gone as far as to offer their full support. They would provide refreshments, space, and ensure that everyone felt welcome, something Jerome found ironic, given how different things had been just a week earlier. Jerome glanced at the flyer Marcus had sent over for final approval. At the top, in bold letters, was the name they had decided on for the event. "All aboard, the sea belongs to everyone." Underneath, smaller text read, "An open conversation on equality, representation, and breaking down barriers in elite spaces." It felt perfect, simple, direct, and hopeful. He took a deep breath, scrolling through his contacts. He knew there was one more call he needed to make, one that could add even more weight to the event. He selected the number and pressed call. After a few rings, the line connected. "Mr. Porter," Jerome said, smiling as he heard the familiar voice on the other end, "I hope you're doing well. I wanted to thank you for stepping in at the marina that day. It meant a lot." The older man's voice was warm, filled with sincerity. "Jerome, my boy, I've been following everything. You're handling this with a grace that's rare these days. How can I help?" Jerome explained the idea for the event, how they hoped to use this opportunity to foster real dialogue about inclusion, and how powerful it would be to have allies like Mr. Porter on board, people who were already part of these exclusive spaces but were willing to step up and support change. Mr. Porter didn't hesitate. "I'll be there, Jerome, and I'll bring a few of my friends. It's about time we shook things up a bit." When the call ended, Jerome felt a sense of accomplishment. He wasn't alone in this. He had allies, and together they could start breaking down the barriers that had been built over centuries. The day of the event arrived, and the marina was bustling with activity. The yachts rocked gently in their slips as people arrived, an eclectic mix of individuals from different backgrounds. There were young activists, seasoned sailors, professionals from various industries, and families with children, all mingling together on the docks that had once felt so exclusive and imposing. Banners were hung from the rails of the yachts, each one carrying a message of unity. Equal seas for all. Diversity is our strength, and breaking barriers together. The atmosphere was festive, yet charged with purpose. People were laughing, sharing stories, and introducing themselves to strangers, bridging gaps that, in many other spaces, might have seemed insurmountable. Jerome stood by the gangway of freedom, greeting people as they boarded the yacht for the main discussion. He wore a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up, his demeanor relaxed but attentive. His friends stood beside him, their enthusiasm palpable as they ushered people onto the yacht. Natalie handed out small programs detailing the agenda for the day, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Jerome, this is amazing," she said as she paused next to him. "Look at all these people. This is exactly what we wanted." Jerome nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "It really is. I just hope the conversations we have today can spark something meaningful." As the event officially began, Jerome climbed onto the deck of Freedom, where a small stage had been set up with a microphone. He tapped the mic, and the chatter slowly died down, all eyes turning toward him. "Thank you all for being here today," Jerome began, his voice carrying across the deck and the docks beyond. "A week ago, I stood right here on this yacht, facing a situation that no one should have to face. I was made to feel as though I didn't belong, simply because of who I am. But the outpouring of support I received after that moment reminded me of something important. Change is possible, but it starts with us. With our voices, with our actions, and with our willingness to come together despite our differences." He paused, looking out at the crowd, seeing the faces of people who had come from all over to be a part of this moment. "Today is about breaking barriers," Jerome continued. "It's about challenging the idea that only certain people are entitled to certain spaces. The sea belongs to all of us, and so do the opportunities that come with success. We have a lot to talk about, a lot to change, and it starts right here." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jerome stepped back, allowing Marcus to take the mic and introduce the next segment. A panel discussion featuring several prominent voices, including Mr. Porter, Natalie, and a young activist named Aisha who had traveled from New York City to be there. The panelists spoke candidly about their experiences, the barriers they had faced, and the steps they believed were necessary to create a more inclusive society. Aisha's voice was powerful as she spoke about her work with marginalized communities. "We need to stop thinking of certain places, certain achievements, as things that are only for them. They're for all of us, and it's up to us to show up, to claim those spaces, and to support each other in doing so." The conversations that followed were raw, honest, and inspiring. People shared their stories, moments of prejudice they had faced, times when they had felt unwelcome or unseen. But they also spoke of resilience, of the power of community, and of the hope that this event symbolized. Mr. Porter, who had lived most of his life within these exclusive circles, spoke with a sincerity that moved many in the crowd. "I've been a part of this world for a long time, and I can tell you it needs to change. It needs more voices, more perspectives, more diversity, and I'm committed to doing what I can to help make that happen." Jerome watched, feeling both humbled and invigorated by the honesty and openness of the discussions. He realized that this event wasn't just about challenging the prejudices of one marina guard. It was about challenging the prejudices of a society that had for too long accepted the status quo. As the day turned into evening, the sky above the marina was streaked with vibrant colors, deep oranges, pinks, and purples blending together as the sun set over the water. People began to gather once again on the deck of Freedom, this time for a closing ceremony, a toast to new beginnings. Jerome stood at the front of the group, a glass of sparkling cider in hand. He looked out at the faces of the people gathered around him, feeling a deep sense of connection. Here, on this dock where he had once been made to feel unwelcome, stood a diverse group of individuals united by a common goal: to break down the barriers that divided them, to create spaces that were open to all. To freedom, Jerome said, raising his glass high, to belonging, to unity, and to the belief that every person, no matter who they are or where they come from, deserves to be here. Together, we can make this a reality. The crowd raised their glasses, cheers ringing out across the marina. Jerome took a sip, the cool liquid a welcome refreshment after the long, emotional day. He looked out at the sea, the horizon fading into darkness as the first stars began to appear in the night sky. He knew there was still much work to be done, changing attitudes, challenging entrenched systems, ensuring that spaces like these truly were open to everyone. But today had been a start, a powerful first step towards something bigger. And for the first time in a long time, Jerome felt a sense of hope, a belief that the world could change, that people could change, and that his voice, his actions, could make a difference. As the crowd began to disperse, Jerome stood on the deck of Freedom, watching as people lingered on the docks, talking, laughing, connecting with each other. He knew that this was just the beginning, that the movement they had started today would continue to grow, to evolve. Jerome felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Marcus standing beside him, a smile on his face. "You did good today, man," Marcus said. "This is what it's all about." Jerome nodded, his heart full. "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "This is just the beginning." And, as the stars began to twinkle above, Jerome looked out at the sea, the gentle waves lapping against the dock, and he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, standing up, speaking out, and making a difference, one step at a time. 3 months had passed since the incident at the marina in the Hamptons, and Jerome Blake sat in his office, the world beyond the glass window a blur of city life. The incident that had once been a painful reminder of how far society still had to go had now transformed into something more, a symbol of hope and a catalyst for change. Jerome's office, located on the top floor of a sleek skyscraper in downtown Chicago, had become a hub of activity over the past few weeks. Letters, emails, and messages from across the country were piling up, and Jerome's assistant, Jenny, was doing her best to keep everything organized. The shelves were lined with framed photos, his family, his friends, and now a new addition, a photo from the event at the marina, a group shot of everyone who had attended, smiling with their arms around each other, a snapshot of unity. "Mr. Blake, CNN is here for your interview," Jenny's voice called from the doorway, bringing Jerome back to the present. Jerome stood, straightening his tie as he took a deep breath. Today was different from the other interviews he had done. This was an interview not about the incident itself, but about what had come from it, the changes that were being implemented, the impact of the movement that had been sparked, and the new initiatives he had helped launch. The camera crew was already set up in the corner of his office, the lights casting a bright glow over the space. The interviewer, Maria Santos, was a familiar face. Jerome had spoken with her during the initial media frenzy, and now, 3 months later, they were reconnecting. "Jerome, thank you for having us here today," Maria said, her voice warm as she extended a hand. "It's great to see you again." Jerome shook her hand, smiling. "Thanks for coming, Maria. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about what we've been working on." They sat down, the cameras rolling, and Maria began. Jerome, when we spoke a few months ago, it was right after the incident at the marina. You talked about the importance of using your platform to make change. Since then, you've been busy. Can you tell us a little bit about what's been happening since that day? Jerome nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's been a whirlwind, to be honest. The response to the incident was overwhelming, but it also opened doors that had been closed for a long time. After the event we held at the marina, we started seeing real conversations happening, not just in the media, but in boardrooms, in communities, and even in schools. People wanted to understand. They wanted to learn, and they wanted to be a part of the solution. Maria smiled. And you've taken that momentum and turned it into action. I understand you've launched a new initiative called Open Waters. Can you tell us more about that? Of course, Jerome said. He leaned forward slightly, his passion evident. Open Waters is a program that aims to provide opportunities for underrepresented communities to access spaces that have traditionally been closed off to them, whether that's sailing, the tech industry, or other areas of privilege. We've partnered with several yacht clubs, including the one in the Hamptons, to offer scholarships for sailing lessons, internships, and mentorship opportunities. The idea is to break down barriers and show people that they belong regardless of where they come from. Maria's eyes lit up. That's incredible, Jerome. It sounds like you're really making an impact. Jerome nodded, his voice steady. We're trying. It's not just about yachts or marinas. It's about access, about representation. It's about changing the narrative so that the next generation doesn't have to face the same obstacles that I did. We want to show kids that they can dream big, and that those dreams are within reach. The interview continued, touching on the challenges Jerome had faced in launching the initiative, the support he had received, and the stories of the people whose lives had already been touched by Open Waters. By the time the interview wrapped up, Jerome felt a sense of fulfillment. This was a legacy he wanted to leave, not just a successful business, but a path for others to follow. After the interview, Jerome returned to his desk, a stack of letters waiting for him. Jenny had neatly arranged them in a folder labeled Personal Responses. He picked up the first one, recognizing the familiar handwriting of the young girl who had written to him shortly after the incident. Dear Mr. Blake, I wanted to thank you for what you're doing. My name is Kiara, and I'm 16 years old. I saw your video, and it inspired me. I've always loved the ocean, but I never thought someone like me could be a part of that world. When I heard about Open Waters, I applied for the sailing program, and I got in. I just wanted you to know that what you did made a difference, and now I'm learning how to sail. Thank you for showing me that I belong. Sincerely, Kiara. Jerome read the letter twice, his eyes misting slightly. This was why he was doing it, why he had chosen to speak out, to stand up, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. He set the letter down carefully, a smile tugging at his lips. The intercom buzzed, and Jenny's voice came through. Mr. Blake, you have a visitor. It's Mr. Porter. Jerome looked up, pleasantly surprised. Send him in, Jenny. Moments later, Mr. Porter stepped into the office, his familiar presence bringing with it a sense of warmth. The older man smiled broadly, extending his hand. Jerome, my boy, it's been too long. Jerome stood, shaking his hand. Mr. Porter, it's great to see you. Please, have a seat. They settled into the chairs across from each other, and Mr. Porter looked around the office, nodding in approval. You've done well for yourself, Jerome. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, both in business and in this movement. Jerome smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. I couldn't have done it without allies like you." Mr. Porter waved his hand dismissively. "Nonsense. You've got the heart and the courage to make a difference. I'm just here to support you however I can." They talked for a while about the Open Waters program, the progress that had been made, and the plans for the future. Mr. Porter spoke about the changes he had seen in his own community, the way people were starting to rethink their assumptions, to question the exclusivity that had long been a part of elite spaces. "I've even gotten a few of my friends to join the mentorship program," Mr. Porter said with a chuckle. "Old dogs, new tricks, you know how it goes." Jerome laughed, shaking his head. "That's amazing. It's people like you who make the biggest difference, Mr. Porter. When those in power are willing to share that power, to uplift others, real change can happen." Mr. Porter's expression grew serious. "You're right, Jerome, and you're paving the way for that change. The work you're doing is important, and I want you to know that I'm with you every step of the way." Jerome felt a lump form in his throat. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. That means more than I can say." As Mr. Porter left the office, Jerome sat back in his chair feeling a profound sense of hope. The world was changing. Slowly, perhaps, but surely. And he was proud to be a part of that change. The following week, Jerome found himself back at the marina in the Hamptons. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue, and the water shimmered under the midday sun. The marina looked different now. There were new signs posted at the entrance, welcoming visitors and outlining the new code of conduct that emphasized respect, inclusivity, and anti-discrimination. It was a small but significant step, a visible reminder that change was possible. Jerome walked along the dock, his shoes clicking against the wooden planks. He could see the Freedom in the distance, its sleek white hull gleaming in the sunlight. But before he reached his yacht, he stopped, noticing a group of children gathered near the water's edge. They were a part of the Open Waters sailing program, their bright orange life vests standing out against the deep blue of the sea. An instructor was speaking to them, pointing out different parts of the boat, and Jerome smiled as he watched them, their faces filled with excitement and curiosity. "Mr. Blake?" a small voice called out, and Jerome turned to see a young girl, Kiara, waving at him, her smile wide. Jerome walked over, kneeling down to her level. "Kiara, it's great to see you. How's the sailing going?" "It's amazing," she said, her eyes shining. "I've learned so much already. I can't wait to get out on the water." Jerome's heart swelled with pride. "I'm so glad to hear that. You're going to do great things, Kiara, I know it." She beamed, and Jerome stood, giving her a thumbs up before watching as she ran back to join the group. He stayed for a moment, watching as they boarded a small sailboat, their laughter echoing across the marina. This was what it was all about. Creating opportunities, breaking down barriers, and making sure that the next generation had the chance to experience the freedom and joy that came with access to spaces that had once been off-limits. Jerome finally made his way to the Freedom, stepping aboard and taking a deep breath of the salty air. He looked out at the horizon, the sea stretching endlessly before him, and felt a sense of peace. He had come a long way, and there was still a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, making a difference, one step at a time. As the yacht gently rocked beneath him, Jerome smiled, thinking of all the people who had stood with him, who had believed in the possibility of change. And as he set sail, the wind filling the sails and propelling him forward, Jerome knew that the journey had only just begun. Thank you for being with us until the end of this story. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new stories. Share this video with your friends. Maybe it will inspire someone else. And be sure to check out our other videos. There are many more amazing stories waiting to be discovered. See you in the next issue.